They're killing our world! What else can I do?
I don't know. Vote Democrat. Give money to Greenpeace.
That's for saving whales, moron!
The planet is dying. That's a simple fact I think most of us can... The world is burning right now. It's sick, and we're the virus. Don't you get it? The world's dying. The world is dying. And
we're gonna die, man! There's some freaky...
We're living in an age of ecological collapse. It's not coming. It's already begun. Parts of the world, the poorest parts, are experiencing the consequences of man-made climate change. The richest 10% are killing the planet and responsible for overconsumption. 100 companies produce 70% of emissions, and us, the poorest citizens, the working class, and indigenous people, are being blamed for the consequences. Since the coronavirus pandemic hit in early 2020, among a year rife with intense fires and hurricane seasons, as well as growing evidence of ecological collapse, it has become increasingly clear that something has to be done about climate change, and increasingly, there's a call for a particular line of thinking to draw a solution from that makes everyone who notices it and isn't down for it just a bit nervous. How often do you hear the phrase, "we're the real virus"? How often do you hear people lament overpopulation or joke about culling the masses? Corporations and governments creating laws and rhetoric that place the blame for pollution on the working class despite corporations being responsible for 70% of all the world's emissions. You hear these things and something is just off. Like something much worse is lying under the surface of some of these comments and attitudes. What you're smelling is eco-fascism. And also my cheap dollar store deodorant. Look, I'm a college student and I don't have money for the good shit, okay? I'm quick to want to speak up when I hear these things though, because eco-fascism is incredibly under-discussed right now. Despite the fact that within the next 10 years and the hellish period that will come after, eco-fascism is going to quickly become the name of the game. And as we'll find, it already is the name of the game in some places you might not expect. People who insist that our only options are socialism or complete societal collapse, or who act as if there will be no society once the environment collapses, are wrong. Many of us on the left and in society at large are failing to realize that in a country like America, especially America, an eco-fascist government and eco-fascist action is inevitable, if not already present within our government and society, without us even being fully aware. For this video, I want to discuss what eco-fascism even is as a concept, where it is, and what we can do about it. This video will discuss topics such as racism, genocide, and other heavy things. Have fun, kids! Eco-fascism is a line of fascist thinking that is particularly focused on environmental conservation, and it can come from surprising places, such as vegan groups and people, animal rights conservationists, and other similar groups usually seen as snowflake leftists. And this thinking can come from surprising places. There are those on the left and the right who can branch into eco-fascist talking points when they aren't careful. There's immediate cause for concern with any ecological movement that doesn't center itself around the preservation of human life and dignity and social justice. And any movement for the environment that fails to be truly decolonial and to understand how ecological collapse disproportionately affects people of color, specifically indigenous people, is immediately suspicious to me. When you hear people saying things along the lines of humans are the real virus, you should be worried too. In the book Burning Earth, Changing Europe, anti-racist political writer Hilary Moore states that the uncomfortable truth is that there are some far-right and environmentally friendly conservative groups that are genuinely committed to ecology and the natural world. It can be tempting to write off this section of the right wing because it's easier to assume they do not care about the climate. Whatever the reason, the choice to downplay these tendencies is a significant misstep. It not only prevents progressive movements from understanding how the right wing formulates its narratives, some of which are effectively mobilizing people in the streets and at the ballot box, but it also prevents us from accurately reading the rapidly changing political landscape, more specifically downplaying the role of the far right. We are unable to see the nuanced ways in which it leverages environmental issues and climate change toward its own political ends. Starting off simple, what is fascism? Because we can't talk about eco-fascism unless we first break down the parts and explain those, looking at them individually and then holistically to understand the entire scope of the concept, if that makes sense. If you don't know what fascism is, that's okay. You only haven't been paying attention for the last 5 fucking years, but hey, I won't judge you for wanting to bury your head in the sand and scream Hamilton lyrics loud enough to drown out the sound of the existential hell we've all been subject to. I do it too. Fascism is a form of far-right authoritarian ultranationalism that obsesses itself with dictator worship, racism, mythologized histories, and is used to assert the dominance of the ruling class, and more. In 2003, Lawrence Britt outlined the 14 characteristics of fascism as follows: powerful and continuing nationalism, disdain for the recognition of human rights, identification of enemies and scapegoats as a unifying cause of the country's problems, supremacy of the military, rampant sexism, controlled mass media, obsession with national security, religion and government are intertwined, corporate power is protected, labor power is suppressed, disdain for intellectuals and the arts, obsession with crime and punishment, rampant cronyism and corruption, and fraudulent elections. A few of those are very important in recent times, and one of them is going to be very important in the coming days. Eco-fascism is a by any means necessary philosophy where the cost of human life is irrelevant, with the goal of saving the environment in mind. Myths about overpopulation fuel this kind of talk. We've convinced ourselves that as a thing separate from the environment, we must be cleansed from it in order to save it. But we fail to acknowledge how those who usually end up on the wrong side of this kind of talk are usually historically oppressed classes and races. Eco-fascists will often twist things like the coronavirus outbreak as divine cleansing. Someone will say something like humans are the virus, and not acknowledge which humans are most affected by the outbreak and dying most from it, and how it kind of sounds like they're being called the virus. Writer and environmentalist Deja Newton, in her article titled "The Dark Side of Environmentalism, Eco-Fascism and COVID-19, says that the problem with attributing environmental benefit to COVID-19 is that it implies a mass loss of human life is worth it or even necessary for the sake of the environment. We are the virus statements assume humanity and the planet are mutually exclusive. The dangers that lie in this are reminiscent of environmental movements that have in the past advocated for the reduction of non-white, non-Western populations and unfortunately eco-fascism. Eco-fascists celebrate death for the sake of the environment and separate people conceptually from nature, specifically non-white peoples. If the idea that people must die to heal the environment takes root, it is an inevitable guarantee that the people who will be selected to do the most dying and most subject to it will be black, brown, disabled, or queer, or other minorities. So no, humans aren't the real virus. The real virus is J.K. Rowling's Twitter account, let's be honest here. Eco-fascists are obsessed with purifying human genetic stock, removing inferior people or races to make room for the superior. They also, like regular fascists, invoke a mythologized history of humanity, of a time when people were pure before industrialization, as well as the imagery of Norse mythology, and the aesthetics of it as well. All of their obsessions with tradition and romanticization of the past can be traced back to their Nazi roots, as their ancestor movement had the exact same obsessions. For example, Nazi spy Maximiani Giuliano Portas, also known as Savitri Devi, an environmentalist and Nazi who paved the way for eco-fascism, believed that Hitler was the avatar of the Hindu god Vishnu here to save the world as well. Okay, if you want to stop cultural appropriation, she's the final boss. I'm just going to warn you, when you get to her level, she does have a third health bar. Once you get about halfway through, she enters her fourth phase. Yes, she has 4 phases. In fact, eco-fascists have adopted their own form of every tenet of fascism listed earlier. Nationalism that borders on overtly worshipping the motherland or fatherland, scapegoating immigrants and the poor for overpopulation and consumption, disdain for human rights or the value of human life, rampant sexism and the obsession with tradition, including traditional gender roles, an obsession with national security, and more. Not all groups on the far right are genuinely committed to ecology. Even if they are, they might not prioritize that in their campaigns. In Europe, and particularly within youth-based movements, the far-right groups will often address climate change in some manner. Sometimes these arguments sound very similar to the ones put forward by left-wing and progressive climate movements. So now that we know what eco-fascism is, should we even be concerned? After all, many would point out that no overtly eco-fascist government actually exists, to which I would say you're dumb and stupid and foolish and you should feel bad about yourself, because you're wrong. Eco-fascist movements within governments do exist, and in fact, in America particularly, they're already, in some places, fully in swing. Hillary Moore says this about the topic. A moderate right-wing narrative could blame pollution on outsiders, while a far-right narrative might depict intruders or parasites as destroying the integrity of the environment and possibly a society. This kind of nativism, where it calls to promote the interest of native inhabitants over that of immigrants, is common in many far-right and fascistic groups today, and easily pairs with arguments for environmental protection. Native American people in the audience hear that sentence and are like, what the f? Imagine if you busted into someone's house, destroyed the place, and then complained that rowdy guests were ruining your living room, and then kicked out the family that was living in that clean house. Formerly clean, at least. That's America. America is the house, and also the shitty guests. Eco-fascism in government is pervasive among colonial powers like France or America. Something incredibly ironic considering how colonialism caused near ecological collapse on every continent that it took place on before climate change was even a concept. With France, for example, there's the Research Studies Group for European Civilization, also known as Greece? Wait, what the fuck? Greece. Greece. What? The group was founded by philosopher Alain de Benoit. Benoit argues for a concept called ethnopluralism. Ethnopluralism is a belief system that encourages protecting the right to difference, which is essentially code for segregation and anti-immigration sentiment. This organization, like all of the best things, was created in the 70s and still persists to this day, with connections to American neo-Nazis like Richard Spencer and political figures like Steve Bannon, and also laid the groundwork for the French New Right movement and racist anti-immigration concerns that are still relevant to this day. The French National Rally, a far-right political party, aspires to create within Europe the first ecological society. A lie, since indigenous people all over the world had achieved societies that were completely sustainable and living in tandem with their environment way before Europeans killed all of them, collapsed their environments, took all their shit, and then committed genocide and destroyed their homes until there was nothing but wasteland left. The National Rally is a textbook eco-fascist organization, worshipping the nation and its environment while railing against immigrants who they view as having no homeland and being burdens on France's ecosystem. This mirrors other similar European movements such as the Lega or League Party in Italy, while other European political groups like the British Tories pay lip service to clean energy while still courting fossil fuel companies. Like Trump, when he had to pretend to care about things before he learned he can admit to murdering 200,000 people and command white supremacist militias on national television and not be immediately arrested, taken out back, and put down like a lame horse. Some will try to insist that eco-fascist governments don't exist, but I would argue that they're stupid, dumb, and bad. For example, the national parks in America are a form of eco-fascism. The land that is now Yellowstone and other famous national parks in America was lived on and cared for by Native Americans. That land was seized by the government and those people were forced to move to desolate locations that had been purposefully scarred and had their ecosystems nearly shattered by American colonialism, specifically for the purpose of Native American genocide. And the land that they lived on before was seized by the government and its resources were used for the ruling class. Or it was just turned to a place where people aren't allowed to go unless they pay to look at nature, which is a thing that you have to do now. And it feels weird to me that people got on capitalism for monetizing air, and then no one realized that capitalism had already monetized every off on a tangent here. This isn't even in the script. I'm just mad. When Trump boasts that America is full and overpopulated and can't take any more immigrants from the global south, at least, that is a form of eco-fascism. Many people trying to come to America are climate refugees who are living through the effects of climate change and trying to escape it. All the while, America is causing the issues they're trying to escape. These eco-fascist principles already exist and already guide our policy. Eco-fascism online is just as deadly. It inspires terrorist attacks from white supremacists on communities of color, fuels racist thought, and helps to repopulize and legitimize right-wing traditionalism to a new generation. On August 3rd, 2019, a right-wing terrorist opened fire on a Walmart in El Paso, Texas. 23 people were killed. In a manifesto he wrote, the killer explicitly stated that he did the action because the environment is getting worse by the year. Most of y'all are just too stubborn to change your lifestyle, so the next logical step is to decrease the number of people in America using resources. If we can get rid of enough people, then our way of life can become sustainable. If we can get rid of enough people, then our way of life can become sustainable. Obviously, he's completely and utterly wrong. Murdering innocent people, The deaths of innocent people will never save the world, ever. Only the abolishment of the system we live under, of settler colonialism, capitalism, fascism, and American hegemony, will bring about the changes needed to save the planet. But these kinds of sentiments are growing stronger and louder and risk drowning out the voices saying what actually needs to be done. So what does eco-fascism look like? How can we spot it? As stated before, right-wing politicians and thinkers will often use the language and aesthetics of ecology to slide further along the right-wing racist agendas that they already have, railing against immigration, multiculturalism, modernity, and more, and advocating for the existence of a white ethno-state, specifically because, in their minds, degenerate races and the overpopulation of us degenerate races is the cause for climate change, even though the poorest citizens, which in racist countries like America are usually mostly people of color, have lower population and consume less than ruling class whites and the upper class in general. Online, eco-fascists use the same language as regular Nazis and fascists, applying terms such as blood and soil and other slogans. They have fixation on Nordic aesthetics, culture, and paganism, specifically employ runes such as the Algiz life rune as symbols. There is an overall obsession with the past and archaic traditions from a history that is heavily mythologized. Eco-fascists and Nazis obsessed with gender roles and tradition are made a little funnier to me by knowing the actual Norse culture that they obsess over was fairly egalitarian, and that Vikings peacefully interacted with people of all races on multiple continents, and in some cases, some of these people decided to sail with them, and that means that groups of Vikings were actually a little more diverse than people expect, just like all of history. Essentially, eco-fascists worship at the shrine of the same traditionalist death cult as regular fascists. Though, while actual hardcore eco-fascists are hard to find online, there are plenty of people making the same comments about overpopulation in certain areas or in certain contexts that are just a bit suspicious. Capitalism will not kill us. It'll slide further and further into eco-fascism to allow profits to continue on whatever husk of an earth remains. And we're already letting them start doing it. So how the hell do we stop it? The process of stopping the appropriation of climate-conscious movement by fascists and halting the rise of eco-fascism must revolve around us changing the way we address climate change and climate justice. Most specifically in settler colonial states like America and the global network of nations held under her thumb. We must start with acknowledging that the indigenous peoples of now collapsing and damaged environments managed the land they lived on successfully for thousands of years, and that any attempt to go back to a time before widespread ecological collapse will require us to re-examine and re-adopt those methods, and thus any movement for climate justice must be indigenous-led or take indigenous voices and methodology into special consideration, especially since indigenous communities in the Americas, along with other communities of color in America, have been the primary victims of the perils of climate change and climate injustice. Black and brown people are the most subject to air pollution and the effects thereof, and indigenous communities have been subject to water shortages and crisis and food unavailability and more due to climate destruction since white people landed on these continents. In the far north, indigenous people who have lived and worked on the Arctic ice for thousands of years are now living in a world where the ice they depend on no longer exists. In the global south, indigenous people in the Amazon and the rainforest are losing their homes to fires and capitalism and people farming in order to supply the meat industry. People of color are the ones suffering from climate change the most, whether in southern states and US territories like Louisiana, Florida, Texas, and Puerto Rico, or in the northern territories of Inuit people struggling in Canada, Greenland, and Alaska. Therefore, centering climate justice on those most affected by it forces the conversation to be recentered from white, right-wing traditionalist and fascist myths about climate change to those who need to be protected the most, and to a theory and practice more solidly rooted in achieving justice for disenfranchised racial groups harmed by large-scale ecocide set off by white settler colonial culture. Climate justice means tackling the problem head-on by ending the era of extreme energy, reducing carbon emissions, and creating meaningful work that connects urban and rural communities, while at the same time working to reconstruct the social and political relationships whose erosion has brought us to such extreme conditions. In practice, this means prioritizing human rights over borders, building localized democracies and public and community-controlled economies, and uplifting the solutions and leadership of communities on the front line of climate change. Thank you for taking time to watch this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider leaving a like or subscribing and giving me the validation I crave since my parents hate me. You can also subscribe to my Patreon and be like the cool people who did that. Thank you to those people. You should be one of those people, otherwise you're not cool. You're not cool like us. Join the cool kids club. In the meantime, I hope you guys have a nice day. I hope that you stay safe, that you wear a mask,